Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. Hello, my name is Orilonise C.D. Yarborough. I want to thank the committee and my guests for coming today. And my thesis is entitled Black by Birth, Gay by God, Proud by Choice, The Origins and Spread of DC Black Pride. In 1991, a group of Black gay men and lesbians gathered at Banneker Park in Washington, D.C. This day would mark the first Black Pride celebration in the US, kicking off a cultural institution that has spread from the District of Columbia, traveling across the country and the world. Today, the Center for Black Equity is the convener of Black Pride member organizations, with 50 member organizations hosting Black Pride events from DC to Montego Bay. One place the celebration spread to was Charlotte, North Carolina, with the first Black Pride in Charlotte beginning in 2005. My thesis focused on the history and development of this event in DC and its spread into the rest of the country, beginning with Charlotte, North Carolina as a case study of how the development of Black Pride sprang up in the Southeast. In this thesis, I analyzed the development of DC as a city and how that facilitated the development of DC Black Pride. I highlight three distinct areas of Black LGBTQ life that facilitated its spread outside of attendance at the event, and then I move into the focus on Charlotte Black Pride as a case study for the specific contours and challenges of putting up a Black Pride in the Southeast, as well as identifying links between DC and North Carolina through their Black Prides. In chapter one, I cover the history of DC's political development from the establishment of home rule in the 1970s to the Williams mayoral administration in the early 2000s, juxtaposing this alongside the development of Black Pride, starting with the staff party at an after hours club that Black Pride would grow out of, known as the Children's Hour, and moving up through the revitalization efforts Mayor Williams and the government would instate and the growth of the city post 2008 that shifted the makeup of DC. Throughout changing mayoral administrations, the push and pull of federal and city governments, and growing cultural visibility in the HIV and AIDS epidemic, DC Black Pride would emerge as an institution operating both inside and outside of the city as a fixture for Black LGBTQ life. As this space grew, representatives from other cities and states would come together to share resources and organizing skills to develop their prides together in a formation known as the International Federation of Black Prides. In chapter two, I move into detailing these three distinct sites of communication and liberation and LGBTQ life that helped facilitate the spread of Black Pride outside of at the event itself. These areas that I looked into were self-publication, erotic performance, and the role of party promoters, DJs, and traveling events. The first space that I looked at was self-published writing and art, which spread public health news that was not being covered by mainstream news publications around care for HIV and AIDS, community news, and art that would have been censored in the mainstream. These publications would continue to grow in sophistication from the Fire Next Time, which was the precursor to Blackout magazine that was published by the National Coalition of Black Lesbians, Gays, and Bisexuals, um, to Blacklight magazine, to Women in the Life magazine, which was a lesbian magazine published by Sheila Alexander Reed. These would become a central part of the Black gay Renaissance, which is a period that refers to the art and organizing work that Black LGBTQ people were doing in this time. Um, the second aspect that I looked at was that of erotic performance. Erotic performance acted as a type of communication due to traveling dancers who danced at events in other cities and those patrons who would travel into DC to see them. Due to the uniqueness of DC's laws regarding dancing, it was a haven for people who were seeking nude establishments, full nude dance establishments. And this reputation facilitated many things, chief among them a divide between respectable expressions of queer life in public and those that were deemed unrespectable. During the 1970s to the 1990s, these clubs would operate with little city interference. However, this would all change with greater oversight from the Alcohol Beverage Regulation Administration, which regulates liquor licenses in DC. This division, alongside police, would begin raiding gay establishments in the area, charging establishments with liquor license violations and alleging that they were operating as sex oriented businesses. The growing regulation and harassment by police and government entities would end with the clubs and businesses being seized by eminent domain in 2004, with the buildings being cleared to make way for the new National Stadium that was built in 2008. Many of these businesses continue to experience government harassment via the stigmatization of sex work and red tape, such as the zoning requirements in DC and a law that was passed in 1993 that forbade the issuance of new liquor licenses to new dance establishments. The perspective of dancers, DJs, and patrons who frequented these establishments provided a new understanding of how DC changed over the years and raised important questions such as whose landmarks are considered valuable, what is the true function of police, and who is the true canary in the coal mine for shifting cities and gentrification. Excuse me. The last site that I looked at was the work of events, DJs, and party promoters. They also emerged as a type of communication due to their traveling nature as well. DJs would travel outside of DC to DJ parties in New York or Miami, and then telling people where they were from. People would then travel in to see them as Pride developed. As they grew in their influence, some of them would shift into becoming party promoters and would create spaces for people to still gather, even in the face of the loss of physical space that was happening. So, for example, this red flyer in the upper right hand corner is a flyer for the Black Pride Bar Hop that was started by DJ India. DJ India is a Black lesbian DJ in DC who has been DJing since she was very young. And she cut her teeth really DJing in a lot of those clubs that I talked about in Southeast. As those clubs were beginning to be shut down, she would start renting spaces on 14th Street Northwest. And the bar hop started out of her renting 3 bars with 3 different DJs, and it eventually became so big that it would spill out into the street. The police would take the street off, and it would be sort of a balm, in a sense, for the loss of physical space that was happening and continues to happen in the present day. In chapter 3, we leave DC and we arrive in Charlotte to engage with Charlotte Black Pride as a case study for the spread of Black Pride in the Southeast. And this was interesting to me because conventional wisdom would say to choose Atlanta because it is a larger pride, but I specifically wanted to pick prides that did not have such a large public focus on them to see how they specifically developed outside of major metropolitan areas that we associate with pride, such as San Francisco or New York City or Los Angeles. Um, some of the key links that I found between DC and North Carolina were in 2 people. Earl Folks, who is the current president of the Center for Black Equity, which was known as the International Federation of Black Prides. When he joined, he actually became the field coordinator. So he would travel to different prides, offer assistance to people if they asked, and just observe and see what people needed in order to help make their spaces possible. And also found a connection in the work of Mandy Carter, who's a prolific Black lesbian organizer who had hands in both the DC Black Pride and starting Triangle Pride after the Little River murders in the 1980s, and also served on the board of elders that Charlotte Black Gay Pride put together to help support and guide their work. So when I began this thesis, I wanted to study this event as its own historical intervention and manifestation, rather than just as an offshoot of mainstream prides. The field of literature that I engaged with was established and growing specifically in oral histories, monographs, and archival collections. Some of the books that helped to inform my analysis were There's a Disco Ball Between Us, A Theory of Black Gay Life by Jafari S. Allen, Evidence of Being, The Black Gay Cultural Renaissance and the Politics of Violence by Darius Bost, At the Club, Locating Early Black Gay AIDS Activism in Washington, D.C. by Darius Bost, and All I Could Bear, My Life in the Gay Strip Clubs of Washington, D.C. by Craig Seymour. There's a Disco Ball Between Us really helped me establish the development of my theoretical perspective that was growing over my study of the event. Allen's concepts of Black queer temporality influenced my desire to use oral history as a tool to collapse time and to study what he defines as Black gay habits of mind and ways of being across a formal network of people that are also connected in informal, quote unquote, ways. These ways of being were developed over the long 1980s, which he argues we must recategorize in order to understand the sustained impacts not only of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, but the impact of Black LGBTQ organizing, Black lesbian feminist theory development, and the Black gay art renaissance. Allen also seeks to locate organizing outside of politics itself, locating community organizing, archiving, academic work, sex parties, and the literature and art of Black LGBTQ people as constructing a distinct politic. Evidence of Being and At the Club by Darius Bost were the two pieces that I read when I first started working on this that located Black activism and prides, clubs, and social settings outside of their inception and transformed the idea of where and how historic sites existed, as well as fomenting the idea of networked communication in informal ways for me. In this book, he traces the connections of Black gay writers from DC to Baltimore to Philadelphia through their own informal networks of communication. And All I Could Bear by Craig Seymour is a really wonderful memoir and ethnography that Seymour wrote while he was a graduate student at the University of Maryland. While he was a graduate student at the University of Maryland, he also worked in some of those clubs that I referenced in chapter 2, most specifically Secrets and Lakaja Falls. While he was working there, he was conducting interviews with dancers and patrons about why they come to the club, what their motivations were, what they got out of it, and processing and analyzing his own experiences through the use of ethnography. He also provides really detailed history on gay DC from the early 1900s all the way up until the 1990s when these clubs were beginning to experience harassment. But I really appreciated this piece of work because it felt like a way to really bring readers into what was happening rather than having them just observe what was happening and kind of hitting on that aspect of temporality that I was talking about with Dr. Allen's book. Some of the primary source material that I engaged for this thesis included things like Black Pride guidebooks, organizing curriculum notes by Mandy Carter, newspapers such as Q Notes, Black Light, Washington City Paper, Washington Informer, club flyers, magazines, and organizing pamphlets. I also found a lot of valuable information in the DC Office of Historic Preservation's LGBTQ Historic Context Statement, which provides a very detailed history of Black gay DC from the late 1800s all the way up into around the 2010s, as well as a parcel of national parks building surveys where a person went around and documented all of the LGBTQ nightlife spots that were in DC and wrote small histories about those places. The goal of this project was to create an oral history collection that focused on the development of Black pride across the country. And using oral history, I hope to locate DC as an important site of Black LGBTQ history, as well as gathering more understanding on how this developed as its own necessary historic phenomenon. And I also sought to pay special attention to how Black pride is being conceptualized in the present day in its unique expression. Some of the major findings that I came away from this with was the use of oral history as a tool to add depth to historic narratives. So for example, I spoke with Ash Williams, who is an organizer that I know from Charlotte, Um, I had been seeing ASH along with a lot of other organizers around 2017, really starting to push for divestment of corporate money and police from Pride spaces. When Ash and I talked about this, he had informed me that Charlotte Black Pride and Charlotte Pride had decided to divest from police for this year's Pride. But we talked about the fact that historical amnesia exists and the political weather has changed. 5, 6 years ago, that was not a popular ask. People were being having trash thrown at them at prides for shutting down prides, that were engaging with corporate sponsors, being told they were buzzkills or ruining a party, and seemed vaguely reminiscent to me of the 1974 Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade, where Sylvia Rivera was very famously booed off of the stage after telling the crowd about the experiences that people were having in prisons and trying to get them to help her with supporting them. People did the same thing to her. And so wanting to use this as a way to add depth to the narrative and also analyze, like I said, how the political weather has shifted over time to make more things possible, but to also talk about, it's important to name who was talking about these things first, for co-optation and other reasons. I was really interested in documenting other factors that allowed this celebration to spread outside of physically attending the event, and going off of the networks of informal communication. One thing I've observed in my own life is that while we might not be in the same physical location, we are probably less than 3 degrees of separation away from each other through either attending different events in different cities together, or now more recently with the rise of the internet. um, but this emerged to me as an important factor for how this was able to grow so quickly and how it was able to spread as far as it did. And as a former organizer, something I was really interested about was using this to reformat ideas of what a political participatory space is. Not everybody is interested in doing electoral work or is, ready to be on the front lines. But somebody can write, somebody can lay out a magazine, somebody can create a space, somebody can call people together. And liberation of political things did happen in these spaces that might seem kind of nebulous. Like, I don't think anybody would really expect political liberation to be happening in the strip club. But through the research that I did, it's possible and it is and was happening. And so trying to use this to back up on ideas of what a political liberatory space is and can be. And this is important to me because when I first arrived in DC in 2015, this picture in the top left hand corner is me at my first Makers Lab party that was planned by my mentor, who used to have a collective of artists called Makers Lab. Um, I fell into this really beautiful community of artists and creatives, and folks who just really helped me push my own understanding of LGBTQ history, Black LGBTQ history, as well as just being interested walking around DC and wondering what was there beforehand. Many of these clubs and businesses, right, have been raised and something new has been put on them, but there is always something small where you can see it and be like, something else was here before this was. What was that thing? So this really pushed my desire to want to know what those places and spaces were. Before the pandemic hit, we were actually planning a retrospective and pop-up archive with my mentor for the 30th anniversary of DC Black Pride that was not able to come to fruition. But in 2020, I was invited to join the curation team for a virtual Black Pride experience that my mentor planned called Black in Space. And during this project, I became more and more interested in learning about the history of DC's LGBTQ community. Um, I also did a lot more of actually working with elements of oral history, interviewing people, kind of playing around without really knowing what I was doing, until I came to school and I was like, oh, this is oral history. And so I was interested in continuing to use that medium to support me as I studied this topic. And for my next steps, I'll be finishing up my study of Charlotte, North Carolina this summer. I also have some plans to reach back out to some DC narrators that I wasn't able to connect with. And I'm also working on designing a research plan for new cities such as Jackson, Mississippi, and Greensboro, North Carolina. After I make these necessary edits and revisions, this thesis will then be turned into an article that will be published following my fellowship at the National African American Museum of History and Culture that starts this coming fall. And with that, I would like to thank the committee for reading my thesis and for listening to my defense. And I would like to thank my guests for coming, and thank you all for being here. And then these are just my photo citations.
So, Ori, we're going to say thank you so much for the very well organized introduction to your work. At this time, what we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of rounds of questions from the faculty members here. I anticipate that this will be a very engaged and engaging discussion, and looking forward to it for some time. Dr. Gershenhorn, I think we're going to keep the tradition going, and we're going to start with you.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Ori, this is a very, I think, a very important thesis that you've written on a very relevant topic, certainly today and in recent decades, and even of course before that. And there's a lot here. You've done a lot of research, and I mean, I think you mentioned it could be talking about an article, but to me it could easily be a book as well, because you've got so much here. So let me start out with the title. Not necessarily the title, but the subtitle, where you talk about the origins of Black pride, which certainly this thesis is about. But I think it's about more than that. It's I think you kind of make a strong argument, obviously, for DC, talking about Black pride in DC and the influence in creating the other Black prides in other cities around the country. But you also highlight divisions within the community that create, well, first of all, I guess divisions starting with I guess mainstream pride celebrations and marches, and then the development of Black pride. But even within the Black pride, especially I think in the chapter maybe on Charlotte, but also within DC, where you talk about some groups being marginalized. I think you highlight trans people in particular, and that is I think as you make the case, that's kind of a through line in the story, in the history of LGBT people, and kind of the long-term harassment and oppression by usually by outside groups, but also sometimes by inside groups. So it seems to me that's an important part of what you're doing, as well as talking about, you talk about these liberatory spaces. And of course, you do argue that's obviously connected to the Black prides, but it's also kind of its own thing too, I think. So perhaps, and you can think about this, it's your thesis, it's your title, but one of the things people see immediately, and what catches people's eyes with regard to a thesis when people are doing a search, is the title and the abstract. So by putting, either liberatory spaces, or I don't know if you would put something about divisions or trans, or some of those terms, you might catch more people who would have a better idea of what the thesis includes. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
That is a good point. I think I struggle with synthesis. So I pulled the title from a publication called Out in Black that was actually published in Raleigh, because I was trying to connect DC and Durham, but just the links weren't really there. And so the closest, strongest place that I had a link was in Charlotte. But I say all that to say that I think I'm going to add that into the abstract. I think I've kind of touched on it a little bit in the abstract, but I could make it more precise in that space.
Okay, good. Before I go into kind of more substantive points, just in terms, and I know that it's always a struggle to complete this thing by the deadline, and you may have made some of these revisions already, but some of your footnotes were either incomplete or didn't have the source. So just make sure you go through those carefully and make sure those are all in there. With your bibliography, and this might have been just an oversight, but you didn't include your interviews. And as you say, one of the important aspects is the oral histories are so important. And it sounds like you're going to make those available. I guess that's another question I had, because but first of all, add them, of course, to the primary sources. But are you going to make these oral histories? But how are you going to make them available? Are they going to be online? Are they going to be at some archive? Or
so I'm trying to conceptualize that right now. I have kind of been using grad school to develop my own politic around doing work of this nature, and I don't feel that I have ownership of these stories. And so what I want to do is come up with some type of like fair use agreement or like donation system to give these like files to local repositories, because in my study of Charlotte in particular, I found that they're actually doing an oral history project on Charlotte Black Pride. And so if I can, help make less work, that's really what my goal is for these. And I was also thinking about uploading them to some open source places like the Internet Archive and the Digital Transgender Archive, just so they have places to live where anyone who wants to hear them can access them.
right. Okay, that'd be great. Yeah. Okay, let me see what else. I mean, I guess one of the big challenges, you have so much here, and obviously this is also a personal story to you, which is not actually that unusual. A lot of theses, people decide on a topic based on personal interests. But so in terms of the organization of your thesis, and obviously once again, time will not allow major reorganization, but maybe something to think about as you move forward, if it becomes an article or another form. So your introduction, well, not your introduction, but your first chapter kind of gives background on DC, and as you say, DC politics, and moving from there. Your introduction is good. I mean, you give kind of historiography, you give chapter summaries, you explain what you're going to do in the thesis. But when we get to the end, like in chapter 4, which you're titling kind of the future of Black Pride, I think something like that, you also include a lot of issues related to methodology. You talk about the importance of oral history, and that definitely should be in the thesis. But I think it would be stronger to put it up front, to tell the reader, the methodology going up front and why it's significant in the way you're doing it, than to put it in the back. So that's just a kind of a thought I had, and kind of related to that. So, one of the challenges also is that, obviously this is an ongoing issue. And, there's a lot of stuff going on, very recently and, at the current time. But you want to keep the whole thing kind of historicized and be clear about when events occurred. And I mean, my general, my own kind of bias is toward, telling the story in a chronological sequence. And you can't always do that because you have different themes and you have to kind of backtrack and tell the story of a particular theme if you're doing something else. Like, you're talking about Charlotte in one of the chapters. So you're going to give kind of maybe some backdrop there on Charlotte. But for example, once again, I think in chapter 4, you talk, and you brought it up in your presentation, talk about Sylvia Rivera and that event, in New York in 1974 was so important. And as you say, you kind of compare it to a more recent event where something similar happened to show, kind of shows unfortunate continuity, and maybe in some ways things haven't changed as much as maybe you might hope. But I would kind of put that back earlier. I mean, you can refer to it again later on, but I would give that to the reader early on to give the reader a sense of the history of the type of divisions that were within, even among activists, because the people who were present, at the, event, where was that, on Christopher Street, or, where Sylvia Rivera was booed off the stage, those weren't, those are activists who were listening, you would think. Mm-hmm. And then they were, booing her off the stage. So, but I kind of would put that earlier when you kind of give the background of the kind of prehistory of Black prides, of, and what, what the importance of Black prides were given, and, given what happened earlier, and then, the kind of ongoing, divisions that occur, even in a different time period, but, in some ways, perhaps somewhat similar. I don't, do you have any thoughts about that, or what do you think?
I am interested in moving it a little bit forward into the chapter. I think I just need to take a little bit of time to sit with where and how it could fit.
Right. I mean, it's always a challenge. I mean, I think I saw Dr. Johnson made a note about chapter 4, where you call it the future, but mixed in with there is kind of the future and a little bit of the kind of either past or recent past. Mm-hmm. And he had mentioned perhaps break part of that chapter into a conclusion, or sometimes we do an epilogue, what's happening going forward. And part of that could, be in a kind of, a standalone chapter or by itself. Once it's once again a matter of reorganization. I think all the information is very valuable, and I think for the most part you tell it's a well-written thesis, and it's you make a clear story. But these are kind of quibbles about organization and how might be best to still tell a story, and that type of thing. Maybe I'll stop here for now, since Dr. Johnson said we'll do 2 rounds, so I'll let Dr. Parker go.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gershenhorn. Ori, I think you've done an outstanding job here, without a doubt. Every paper that I've read always made me raise my eyebrows just a little bit. I think that you are an excellent writer. You think out of the box, and I just enjoyed reading this. I just have not read anything quite like it before. But one question for you in general terms is, in 2 years and 5 years, to what extent do you think the academic community, or perhaps people outside of the academic community, will look at will go to ProQuest and actually pull your thesis because it fills an empty void, and they're looking for something that is going to help them understand Black pride? So the bottom line is, what contribution do you think you have made to the historiography on Black pride or the topic in general?
I think in my thesis, I wrote a little bit about Nelson Sullivan, who was a filmmaker in New York City in the 1980s, who recorded over 12,000 hours of folks who were queer folks who were living on the Lower East Side. So folks like RuPaul, Christine the Superstar, folks who would go on to become sort of luminaries in media and entertainment. And this was archived after his death at New York University. But when I saw the clips from his collection in a documentary that came out on FX this summer called Pride by Angelica Ross and Raquel Willis, it really impacted me because it felt like sometimes when we talk about the 1980s or even the 1970s, like it's hard to get inside of what was happening or to really understand what was happening, to just read it. But to see like a young RuPaul just living her life and doing her little drag shows and making performance art in this city, I think added a different contour to it, as well as the nature of conversations that people were having in those videos, right? So drag queens in particular talking about going out in drag and like, having these sort of knowing glances with women about like who they were and why they were dressed this way and how that was like supporting them and moving through the world was just very impactful. And so I hope that this collection has the same impact where kind of like with the temporality aspect that I was talking about and I engaged with through this thesis, video and audio create a collapsing of time that I really appreciate, because the thing that really also struck me about that part of the documentary was that they don't let you know that Nelson died until the end. So it's set against the backdrop of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, but it's not miring people in struggle, right? It's not miring people in tragedy. It's celebrating their lives in fullness and in color. So that's really what I hope that this does. I hope that it helps to celebrate our lives in color and to not just mire us in like the struggles, right? To talk about the struggles, those things are important, but also to really like showcase our joy, our laughter, the places that gave us solace and comfort and things of those nature.
As I read through the thesis and actually beginning with the introduction, and especially in chapter 4, it appears that everything that has happened in the last 40 to 45 years is actually a movement. Would you define it as a movement? Why is it necessary? Well, let me ask you this. Everything that happened in terms of the parades, in terms of the clubhouses, in terms of everything that you actually have here, are those political statements? Is the community putting people on guard that we are here? Is this a movement in the last 40 to 45 years?
I would say so, but not in the sort of express domain of like legislation and political representation. So I kind of referenced this in the first chapter when talking about the differences between like Black and white organizing, where white organizing was really focused on we need to gain rights and political representation. We need to show that we are as normal and as, we're just regular people and things of that nature. When I started looking into Black queer organizing, it was like, we're already Black, like we're already coded in a particular way, right? So we're not as much invested in the front end on gaining political representation in that way. In the front end, it was like, we need safe space to gather, we need safe space to care for our people, we need safe space to be with one another. And a thing that has always stood out to me was having a conversation, I think it was with Wason Jones, who was a part of the Enoch Alley Coffee House. And if I remember correctly, he said something along the lines of like, we didn't have a neighborhood. Like we were all Black and queer. We all lived around each other. We all worked together. We all knew each other. So the idea of community care, right? The idea of community connection as political was something that I really wanted to focus on, but not in funneling it through this like, typical way of like, organizing for legislation or running for office. Those things are important, but that wasn't what I was seeing in terms of how this developed.
But I'm looking at it, and it seems to contain all of the ingredients, at least for my definition of what a movement is. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you look at the civil rights movement, you look at the women's movement, you look at other movements that have occurred in the country, especially since the 1960s, it appears to me that what has happened in the last almost 50 years is, I think that it can be actually categorized as a major movement in the country. And I think that as historians look back on it in 40 or 50 years, my hope is that they will give it that kind of stamp that indeed it is and has been a movement for almost 50 years or so. In terms of actually writing in a historical format, I don't know if you all have gone back and done this throughout the thesis, but you want to always write in the past tense. You want to refrain from using words like, let me give you a couple of examples here. This would be the time. Writing in the past, but writing in the present. It's important that you not use would be, that you actually write in the past, because you are a historian looking back on yesterday. And I know that in the 4th chapter, you absolutely place yourself right in the mix, especially. And I have a question about that in just a minute. But I think it's really important that you write about yesterday. And the other thing, of course, would be, when I was in graduate school many, many years ago, we were always taught that you never use the word I, pronoun I, we, our. Now, I'm an older man, and I've retired. I don't know if the landscape has changed over the past 5 or 6 years since I retired. But in chapter 4, if there's some kind of way you can write it without actually using those pronouns, but actually understanding that this is me. Chapter 4 is me, but I'm writing not about me. It's not an autobiography. It's a historical piece where you are actually pulling yourself out, looking back on, writing this for the readers. Unless you and Dr. Johnson agree that it's okay to do it this way now. I mean, keep it as is, because I know the landscape changes, the conventions change over the years, and this may be wholly acceptable now. I think you all can work that out. And the other thing, I guess, too, the conventions change when it comes to how we actually, structure our footnotes and endnotes. Ibid used to be the little ibidim, the IBID. Sometimes you would just see them, dissertations, thesis papers filled with ibids. I don't think I saw any ibids in yours. I guess rather than actually using the entire citation, like for example, in footnotes 106 through 110, ibid is still appropriate, right? Professors, don't we still use ibid? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, same thing in footnotes 123 through 126, 187 through 189, and probably in 10 or 12 other places, but those are just a few examples. I think overall, I learned a whole lot from reading this, and I agree with Dr. Gershenhorn that, I don't know if you're going on and get that PhD, but surely shaking your head, no, but we trained you to go get the PhD. But anyway, whatever you do with it, I know that something can be done with it beyond the master's thesis, and I would really look forward to, a 300-page piece. There's so much to be done. Why not Greensboro? I looked at Greensboro. Could it be added to the mix here in some kind of way?
It could. I'm interested in studying it because it was one of the first member organizations that came to the inaugural meeting. And so when I started looking into this, I was like, I didn't even know that, I was in Greensboro for 4 years, didn't know Greensboro had a history of a Black Pride. So I guess kind of in keeping with the theme, right? Like traversing some of the places that I have traveled to understand how the history has developed there.
Yeah, and one more time, why was it that you couldn't really make the connection between Durham and DC?
When I spoke to Earl about it, he was telling me that like the representatives had come, but just something had happened where it didn't get off the ground, and Charlotte was like the next strongest place that I could look for that link. And I was trying to chart that specifically to Durham because of Mandy and her work that she had done with getting Our Day Out started in 1981. But as Mandy is very, very prolific in her work, of course, she ended up supporting this pride in Charlotte. And so I was still able to make that link between the two places.
Okay, great job. That's all I have for right now, Dr. Johnson.
All right, thanks. Jerry, before I turn it back over to you, I'm going to go ahead and give some comments and ask a few questions if I can. Ori, I know we've been over this, and I know that you've heard my comments and questions and criticisms and all that kind of thing. And I just want to commend you again. I learned so much through this process, and this is really outstanding. And I agree with my colleagues that one, it should be a book, and two, you should go on and do the PhD. And I'm going to keep singing that until you finally listen. I hope that your village will hear our cries also. So I'm gonna channel my inner Dr. Gershenhorn here and say, the footnotes. I think this is really important. I will share this with you, but we still have a few places. I noticed on page 10, 12, and 19. And then on 26, we still have places where we need to go back and make sure that we have identified, the source that we're referring to. And also, we have a couple of places where you didn't indicate specifically the page number of the source. So if that's a general reference to a source, and in the moment I did not double check to see, then we need some explanatory information there to help contextualize for the reader why there's no page reference there. Sylvia Jacobs was a stickler for our footnotes. She was the chair of the department when Harper and I came through. She was our thesis advisor. Dr. Parker was on my thesis committee, and I will say that he has mellowed quite a bit as he has matured.
Oh man,
He's coming off the top ropes when I was a student. But those footnotes are really important. So I'm really going to encourage you to get back into those. Oftentimes scholars begin with your footnotes to see what your research is based upon. Remember that periods and commas are always inside the quotes. So that's just a rule of thumb. So let's make sure that we check that. Before I get into some of my questions, oh yeah, I talked about this a little bit when I think in going back and forth on Slack, I can't recall now, but for those of us who are on the fringes of scholarship about the LGBTQ community, um, and I know you're writing for a specific audience, I think it would be helpful to have some conversation in your footnotes that helps to, in some ways, clarify, give more detail, enrich our understanding. If it might not be useful in the text, it might be disruptive to the narrative, but it would be appropriate for the footnotes. So don't miss those opportunities to have a conversation in the footnotes with your audience. And there are a few places where I think I've actually already indicated, where we can do that. So I have a few questions for you. I think Dr. Parker was kind of touched on a question that I have. The first one I want to ask is about your scholarship and where your scholarship fits amongst Black scholars. Dr. J is always really interested in our people and where do we fit in this discussion and in the movement. What you shared, what Ash had to say. I was really intrigued by sort of the internal tensions and challenges that arise over class, even within the African American community, right? I think we know historically that we're going to anticipate that we're going to have challenges with our white counterparts, but I think it enriches what you shared even more by being able to highlight some of the internal challenges that grow out of that. But if you could just speak a little bit about where you feel that your scholarship fits amongst the African American scholars that are writing in a similar vein as you.
Um, Over my time doing the research, when I first started in 2020, I did not find as much as I was thinking that I would when I started reading the literature. Um, but as I kept going through the databases and finding other more recent scholarship that has been published specifically on this event, I feel like that is really where I locate myself as a scholar. I think an interesting thing about this time is that people are seeking to do what Jafari Allens was talking about by elongating that period of the gay liberation movement. So, for example, in the documentary that I referenced, conventional wisdom would say that Stonewall was the first riot that was ever led by transgender women. But more recently, people have started to talk about the Tenderloin district in San Francisco and the Compton cafeteria riots that actually predated that event by I think about 3 or 4 years. Um, so there's a sort of insidious is coming to mind, but I don't mean to make it sound that dramatic, but like an issue, right, of that, like these events are happening, right, and they're being lost to time. And our narratives are not developing in a way that is not necessarily wrong, but there's also more that is happening within the story as well that I think younger scholars are seeking to find. Also, in a sense, to leave evidence for people around things that were happening at the time. I try to think of this as, leaving evidence for someone else to know that something else happened and to be able to pick it up and run with it in their own way over time. So that's how I'm thinking about locating myself.
Mhm. Sort of as a follow-up to that, we were in discussion about the relationship, if there is one, between that earlier period, 1969, and Black Pride. How do you see that? I mean, are we talking about a direct connection? Are we talking about a more indirect connection? How do you see, sort of the focus? Your focus is on the Black Pride, in a later time period. How do you see that earlier period sort of informing what's taking place during the period that you focus on?
Um, I think a lot of the spaces, clubs, parties, and events, things of that nature, were really seeded in the 1960s, particularly in DC. What I did not realize is that there was a lot of Black gay establishments in Washington, D.C. Like the earliest one that opened was Nob Hill. Nob Hill opened in 1935, and it was exclusively a social club for Black gay men
Mhm.
that I think ended up closing in the early 2000s. But that's incredible. Like,
Mhm.
who was to know all of that, right? And I see the links between what Pride looks like now, and its starting, um, and the seeding of those places, right? Even though those places might not necessarily exist, they were still containers in which these things grew out of. But also a kind of a reference to what Dr. Allen talks about. He talks a lot about the idea of historic blueprints. And so there are blueprints, right? This is a blueprint for something that has grown and become its own thing. But he also notes that Barbara Smith, in particular, when she was talking about the Combahee River statement, was saying that this is not absolute. Like, it's not, it is a blueprint, but you have your own work to do to make this what it is for you and the time, and to respond to the time now. So that's how I'm envisioning linking these things. Um, and then also kind of backing up on that idea of temporality around the collapsing of time, again, is very interesting to me because in that book he specifically references the metaphor of a disco ball, and so people talking about like the last dance at like clubs that they frequented, and one person specifically says, I looked into this disco ball and I could see all of my friends who had passed. Nobody was sad, nobody was upset, everybody was dancing and smiling and clapping with me. And I think that this work can also help collapse time for folks, right? Where we can actually be present with folks who have passed through their stories or through their retellings of events and things of that nature.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask to make sure that everyone that you're muted if you're on, so that we don't get feedback. Um, so Ori, if we were living in a world without deadlines, um, I, I would push for the inclusion for what you just shared. I think that's because you're making that connection. I think when you write the book, we're going to go ahead and speak that into existence, right? When you write the book, I think that would be especially now that you've indicated. I mean, would you say 1935? That we can go back to that would be an excellent chapter, leading in to what's coming, right? So I would certainly encourage that. There was, again, I really enjoyed reading, as I know I've already indicated that. And you know this question is coming, so because I already gave you a clue that it was coming. So talk to me about the parties and the freedom piece, okay? You touch on it also, like being taken seriously, and that's so important, right? It is. So talk to us a little bit about the parties and link that to the freedom piece and why that's so important.
So I believe that parties are not just parties. They are sites of liberation, they're sites of community, they're sites of exploration. And that was really what I was hoping to highlight in this. I think prides get kind of and Black prides too kind of get kind of a bad rap of like, oh, it's just a party and all they do is just drink alcohol and they party, but it's like very important things are actually happening in the space. So for example, in Craig Seymour's book, one of the interviews that I found really compelling was his interview that he did with a patron named Dave, who would come to La Caja Falls in secrets. And he interviews Dave over the entire course of the book. But in his first interview with Dave, he is asking him, like, why do you come here? Like, what do you get out of it? And Dave is talking about his life as a civil servant during the day, where he could be fired from the government for being out in public. His relationship with his wife at the time, that was not really safe for him to go outside of the conventions, right, of what was expected of him, but he was able to find a space for self-discovery and for joy by just coming to this strip club and watching these dudes dance on the bar in tube socks, which again, no one would expect that like political liberation is happening in a club full of 300 Black lesbians, but that's specifically what Dame and I talked about as well. When those clubs closed, they specifically said, I didn't know that if there was any other place that was going to be willing to open their doors to 300 Black lesbians every Wednesday night. And the fact that that happened for so many years allowed people to grow into their careers, allowed people to grow into like networks of family when people didn't have family or were disconnected from their blood family, is really, really important, and also gives people energy. It gives people, what's the word I'm looking for? The desire to carry on. Like, organizing is hard work. It's very hard work. It's very thankless work. And something that Twere specifically said when I interviewed her was that we can't keep going if we don't party. Like, we have to have these spaces for celebration. We have to have these spaces for connection and for community. And it's not frivolous. Like, it actually saves people's lives. So for example, with the Children's Hour, HIV and AIDS serving organizations grew out of that party. Us Helping Us People Into Living is one of those organizations, and it's still an active HIV and AIDS community-based organization in DC that's literally probably 4 blocks away from where the original clubhouse was. And one of the founders of the Children's Hour, Bishop Kwabena is now a priest in DC. So he moved from hosting this space, which some would argue is spiritual, right? Some people would argue that, like in Dame's interview, when I talked with them, Dame was saying, if someone tears down your church, you can find another church, but it's not the same as being in your own pulpit, right? So in this place that is spiritual, temporal, all of these things are political, all of these things are happening. It's so much more than actually what meets the eye, even in the very public ideas of like people giving out condoms or testing people in the space. So that's really how that has shown up for me in my own personal experience, and then just through this study.
Excellent. One of the things that I'm reminded of, and just listening to you, is the energy that you draw from being amongst like people who are sharing a like experience, right? And it's almost like, as I see it, a way to re-energize yourself to enter into the crazy hostile world that we live in, right? And I could see where that would be so important. I also thought about it though in the connection of being invisible. And in chapter 2, I mentioned that to you. This will be my last question. Talk a little bit about being made invisible and the importance of being visible as it relates to Black Pride.
So over my study of DC Black Pride in particular, there is a shift that happens where people are starting to like move more into the public political sphere, right? So I wrote a little bit about Marion Barry and his campaigning of Black LGBTQ spaces to get folks in the community to support him during his mayoral run. And that did make people more visible. It made their concerns more widely known to folks who are not within that community. But also, as I've been editing, I'm wrestling with like, what are the consequences of visibility too, right? Because people were brought into political administrations to provide insight on Black LGBTQ life and what was happening. And then specifically the flyer that I put up on the erotic performance slide was an insert from the Gay and Lesbian Activist Alliance that was organizing to push the council to stop harassing these clubs. So there is an importance to that visibility, but also in Alan's book, which again, foundational text, I reference it a lot, he talked about how this particular mode of being and habit of mind emerged in places where people were essentially invisible, where people were hiding in plain sight, right? Like the appeal of going to a club like Secrets or La Caja Falls or Tracks was that it was in an area where there wasn't a lot of investment. There wasn't a lot of mainstream businesses or families around. So you could explore and like do what you wanted without having to deal with people looking at you funny or police harassment or things of that nature. But as the city looks to these places as like desirable land parcels, for example, with the stadium, you lose that, right? And then you become more visible. So I think the bar hop is an example of this too, where folks are on 14th Street in the middle of the street. And that is beautiful. And also there is a consequence that can happen to that as well, as we also see in the present day. So I've really been wrestling with what are the benefits of visibility and then what are the consequences of visibility as well, as I've been working through editing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Ori. And I did not say, but to my initial question, I think that what you are doing will, in a certain sense, be pioneering. And just listening to how you define the Black scholars to begin, the first question I asked, I didn't really respond to that. But I just think that speaks to the importance of you continuing this work. So I hope that you will do that. Dr. G.
Thank you. Yeah, I have just a couple of things. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on this discussion about whether you're talking about a social movement here. And I agree with Dr. Parker and Dr. Johnson that it is a social movement, and or at least it has many of the components of a social movement. And your discussion just now about the parties, and I think in a way you mentioned spirituality and you kind of compared it a little bit to the church. And so social movement theory, if you look at, for example, the civil rights movement, you need safe spaces for the people involved in the movement. And the church, for example, was the Black church, Black colleges were safe spaces for African Americans. But by the same token, I mean, what you're describing, these parties as safe spaces. And they provide, even aside from just being a safe space, they provide a number of different opportunities for people to, commune with each other, to speak with each other, perhaps for leaders to emerge, which is another aspect of social movements. So even if other historians haven't characterized them in this way, that doesn't mean you can't. Because, I mean, to me, in the way you describe it, I mean, it sounds very much like, an important space, which is, kind of a prerequisite for a social movement to emerge. People have to have a space where they can commune with each other and, develop their approach to, various ways in which they're being oppressed. And of course, they have to, name the oppression and all that kind of stuff. And, it sounds like, that was at least part of what was going on there. So it wasn't, even though it may have been an escape from day-to-day life, but that doesn't make it less a safe space and that kind of thing. So it can operate as doing both things, And so I would, I think you could certainly continue in that vein. And the other thing regarding social movement is, if you think about, I was thinking about like the Black Power movement and Black nationalism in the 1960s and 70s. And there was also a divide, which could be somewhat similar here. You talked about, that, some individuals weren't always interested necessarily in politics or running for office or that kind of thing, but organizing within the community and strengthening the community and maybe strengthening the culture. So it's a little bit to me like cultural nationalism versus political nationalism. And that was kind of a divide within, at least for some people in Black Power. But that didn't necessarily make, and yeah, some people were, doing both. Obviously, it's not mutually exclusive. But, that's another way to look at, some of the stuff you're talking about. And the last thing I want to focus a little bit on Charlotte. I have two questions about Charlotte. So you talk about divesting the police. So say a little bit more. What do you mean precisely by? I mean, I know about defunding the police. This movement to defund the police and to remove funding from the police, or there's various versions of that. But what were the organizers of Black Pride talking about with divesting the police?
So divestment talks about removing the police presence, but also, sorry, trying to get my thoughts together. Removing the police presence from Pride, but also calling into question why they are there in the first place. Like, what is their function? Which was why in the part around erotic performance, I highlighted that the police were being used to raid these establishments, not because, there was untoward stuff going on in the establishments, but that's not why they were there. They had been turning a blind eye to this for almost 30 years. And now randomly on a Tuesday in 1993, there's an inspector showing up here and slapping this club with a $50,000 fine for violating the liquor license. That is not about public safety. That's not about public safety. That's not about actually keeping people safe or making sure that people are cared for. It's more about policing respectable ideas of what life looks like, of cleaning up blight and things of that nature. I personally don't think that the police should be at Pride, just because of the history of the event and how police have been used against LGBTQ people to facilitate harm against them. So divestment really calls into question why we have police, why we're funding them, what this funding could be better used for. Around that time, a lot of people were calling for interventions like violence interrupters, mediation, mental health services, and things of that nature to replace the over-reliance that we have on police to solve social issues. But I think the important thing about divestment for me was always, if we talk about removing funding from the source, that's already calling into question why we have it to begin with. Why would I fund it if I could know that I could use this money better? Or why would I fund it to this degree if I know that this money could be used in a different way? So that's the flavor of divestment.
So I'm just thinking, practically speaking, is it, because I've been at a lot of marches and parades and all sorts of things, and the police are, at least in some way, are always there. What's the practicality of getting the police not to be? Is that kind of political action to try to pressure the government not to have the police there? Because I don't think the Pride organizers can, I could be wrong, make that decision on their own and say, okay, we're not going to have the police.
So they can. And in 2017, there was a really big sea change of people starting to mount campaigns to push their prides to not contract with the police. I believe Capitol Pride stopped doing that in 2020, I believe. And as Asher's saying in the chat, they did it in Charlotte. So it is possible to push people to reconsider why we rely on police so much. And in my mind, I think it is more effective to have not community policing. I don't know why that popped in my mind, but like we can create the container safely and we can hold the container safely as a group of people if we just have the foresight to put that in place, right? So for example, in actions, we have people who are looking out for folks, right? Like we have police lookouts, we have police liaisons who specifically talk to the police and negotiate with them. There are people who are assigned to particular roles to make sure that the entire container is safe. And historically, that is something that has happened. There have been leather folks in prides who provided protection in spaces, and folks who have, folks in the community, right, who have stepped up to ensure that the pride space is made safe without relying on an entity that would also police them for being who they were. So yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So I think some of that would be helpful in the explanation, a little bit of an explanation. And so my understanding now is that the organizers are actually paying police to be there. They're actually funding them.
So they are contracted by organizations to be at prides, but like for example in DC and Capitol Pride, sometimes they will just be invited to come. There's a gay and lesbian liaison unit in Washington DC, and they normally have a flyer, not a flyer, excuse me, a float at that pride. But again, it just doesn't really make sense to have police at a celebration of an uprising against the police. It's all, to me, it's always been slightly counterintuitive to like rely on this force when like the whole point of this was to get these people out of our spaces because they were harassing us. Yeah. And oh, sorry. And then talking about the gay and lesbian liaison unit, that to me also has a very particular function of making us okay with this sort of behavior, right? Of making it normal and accepted that like, as you know, it's a cop, but it's a lesbian cop who's like walking through the bar, or it's a trans cop who's like walking through the bar. But you can still be an agent of oppression even if you have some type of same identifying quality as I am, right? Like just because we're all queer doesn't mean that we can't harm one another or be used by the state to harm each other.
Right. And you may already have this in there, but I mean, in terms of the police harassment of Black venues, I mean, it kind of fits into the whole targeting or over policing of the Black community that a lot of historians and others have written about. So the other question is about Charlotte. So I think it's on page 61 when you start talking about Charlotte, and you call Charlotte a progressive place. And I think for most of that period that you're writing about, from 87 to 2009, all of Charlotte's mayors were Republican. And I don't remember Charlotte as being that progressive. Now, it could be that what you mean to say is that Charlotte is, you know, a lot of historians have written about the so-called progressive mystique that Bill Chafe talked about for North Carolina. North Carolina has not been very progressive in its history. And I would say Charlotte hasn't been that progressive either. So I would, if you mean to say that it claimed to be progressive, or it had a progressive myth about it, you know, that would be something different. But I wouldn't, especially since all the evidence you give is that it wasn't progressive.
In terms of the amount of LGBTQ bookstores, like places for social life to flourish at that time, I would say it was progressive. But also, as Ash is uplifting in the chat too, we talked a lot about that veneer of like progressivism that Charlotte has had. So while it has had all of these bookstores and events and places for LGBTQ folks to gather, like I wrote about with the Gang of Five and the Mecklenburg County Commissioners, right? I agree with you that veneer is it's very thin, for lack of a better word, when you look at what's actually happening on the political scale. And then largely in the world at that time, there was a very big backlash against the publicizing of LGBTQ life in that way. So in the same way that in Charlotte, the Arts and Sciences Council was stripped of its funding for having for showing Angels in America at the time. Marlon Riggs, who got a National Endowment of Arts grant to make his essay film Tongues Untied, was also being bashed on the Senate floor as like a example of degeneracy in America and abuse of tax dollars. So trying to fit it all into a larger happening, while also hoping to back up on those sort of what's what I'm looking for. I hate to use the word veneer again, but that mystique that you were talking about. So I can make that more explicit as I continue editing the chapter.
Yeah, and I would just say the government was conservative. Some of the people, I mean, the fact that there were gay and lesbian bookstores, or that is not because the government created them, or Charlotte was progressive. It was because there were progressive people, or people who wanted to create those spaces. So I wouldn't give any credit to the government for, I don't know, permitting them, if that's the kind of case. Now, over time, I think Charlotte's government has become more progressive. But the description of what you're talking about with the government is basically, at that time was basically in the same camp as Jesse Helms, because he's the guy who was denouncing the NEH on the Senate floor, of course, also from North Carolina, and the Gang of Five, sound like they were doing the same thing, or in the same kind of ideology as he had. So I would just distinguish between the government and the people, because I would then give the credit to those who were creating a more maybe progressive atmosphere within the city, within the culture, where the government was trying to stop that. I mean, just like you see today, where many government officials are trying to stop any type of progressive action, whether it's, teaching history, which includes African-American history, or having, oppressing trans people with regard to, the bathroom bill of a few years ago, and those types of things. So it's about an oppressive government. I mean, I would argue in that case, and in, a lot of current situations. It doesn't always reflect, the people. I mean, obviously the culture of a city is mixed. There are some people, who are, a certain way, and others are another way in terms of their ideas and their political views and that type of thing. But I mean, I think it's just one of those things where you're just covering a tremendous amount of ground, and it's always, you have to kind of think of writing for. I mean, I try to write for a general reader, so someone who does not understand, is not from North Carolina, even doesn't know about the bathroom bill, or about the NEH things, or Angels in America and those types of things. And just so you have to kind of briefly explain all of these things when you bring them up. You don't have to go into great detail, but just to help the reader along to understand, because I would think you'd want to have as wide a readership as possible. So you would make the point to all sorts of people. But anyway, as I said, that'll be it for me. But once again, this is an excellent thesis, and I'm really pleased to see, this is truly new work, which is what we like to see in a thesis. This is original and creative, and just great praise for your work.
Thank you.
Dr. Parker?
No, we could be another 2 hours, so no, I don't have anything. We're good.
Okay. All right. Or I hope that, I have this recorded, so any comments or anything that we need to come back to, we'll be able to do that. You know, I'm not going to ask any more questions, as I indicated. We can talk after. What we're going to do, or what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to, everyone who is part of the audience, I'm going to put all of you all in our hangout room, or whatever you call that, waiting room. And I'm going to confer with my colleagues. And then after we've had a few minutes to confer, we'll bring you all back in. At that point, if there are comments that you would like to make and so forth, then you can do that. Dr. Gershenhorn, I see you leaning in a little bit. Did you have a question, comment?
I just wondered if you wanted to offer the audience a chance to ask a question or two, or make a comment now. But
Sure.
I mean, the way is fine.
Sure. No, if you want to make a comment, instead of making the congratulatory comment, if you have one about a question or something about the thesis itself, or a comment about the thesis itself, you can go ahead and make that now. Oh, so what I'm going to do is
I
go
have a
ahead.
question.
Sure,
So,
Jacoby.
yeah, Ori, excellent job. I know we're not supposed to be giving congratulatory remarks, but excellent. I wanted to know how COVID has impacted, and the being in the social distancing space, how that has impacted your methodology and your research. And if you could just share with with me, obviously your classmate and everybody else on the call, how being a historian has been impacted by this pandemic.
Yes, I had to get creative. Normally, I would have gone to these places in person and just seen who I could connect with and done the interviews in that way. But in some ways, it was kind of a blessing to not be able to go in person, because I was able to connect with a lot of folks online. So, for example, the person that I met from the board of Charlotte Black Pride, who I interviewed for the thesis, Quinn, I found Quinn on Instagram. Like, Quinn just came up on my explore page and I liked her content. And then I was like, oh, this person is involved with Charlotte Black Pride. And as it developed, using, I guess, kind of harkening back to those like networks of communication, right? Of like asking folks after I interviewed them, is there anybody that you would suggest that I speak to? And I know people have issues with doing business in the DMs, but I personally have no issue with reaching out to someone in their Instagram DM and being like, can I talk to you about this thing for a little bit? I spoke to this person. They told me about this. Do you mind getting on the phone with me for a little bit? I actually kind of appreciated being able to use Zoom a little bit more. I like to use the handheld recorders, but there's something I think different about being able to be on Zoom and being able to allow people to be in a space that's comfortable for them, that makes them more willing to share things, and also like just brings up like cute little moments that wouldn't happen in a truncated interview session. So for like one of the first interviews that I did with Earl, he was actually staying at his best friend's house in New York, and his best friend comes in and like gives him breakfast in bed. But that launched us into a conversation about like community care, right? Because he was like, I don't know how many people have a best friend who, while they're just staying on their couch, is like, oh, and like, here's your breakfast in bed. And like, this is just the way that we have developed our relationship and how we take care of each other and how that influences our politic. So having those moments, like adding more depth and context to what was happening, was again, an unintended consequence that ended up being very positive.
Awesome.
All right. Seeing no other questions right now, I'm going to go ahead and put you all into the waiting room. see, someone put something in the chat. What does that say? Okay, yeah. Okay, Dr. Gershenhorn, Dr. Parker.
Well, she gets my vote. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah. I
very
thought,
good.
yeah, I thought that was an outstanding thesis, and she's always been highly analytical, super motivated, very easy student to work with. I think we've all had a chance to work with her and kind of get that sense. Certainly someone we'd want to sort of advertise, representative of the department.
Did she express why she doesn't want to get the PhD?
She wants to work in museums, but she's never just come out and said, why not? And she's done great work. She worked at with Adam Rosenblatt and I on a project at Duke. She worked at the John Hope Franklin Center. She won a fellowship, like a $20,000 fellowship from the, I want to say the National Historic Preservation Trust. And then she's the Robert Frederick Smith. I mean, she's done all of this in the amount of time that we have to do it. She just got finished teaching a course over at Shaw. And she's just, wherever she's gone, she's done well enough that people still ask, like, well, is Ori available? You know, that kind of thing. She's really represented us well.
Well, she's
And
got
she's
that
back in
fifth year.
Durham now.
I'm sorry, both of you all were going at the same
Oh,
time.
Freddie, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jared.
I was going to say she's got that 2-year fellowship at the National Museum of African American History coming up, where she's, it pays like something like $60,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So, but you never know what will happen with somebody down the road. But I mean, after that she'll have a lot of opportunities, I assume, as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But she's based in Durham now, or she's in the DC area?
Actually, I think she is. I don't know, Doc. It seems like she was moving here at one point, and
Right.
then we've always met on Zoom. So
And she's been in classes when I've had. She wasn't in my class this time, but in the fall she was in my class where I did face to face, and she was there. I think she did come to Durham. Now
Yeah.
she was based in DC before this, like she says, and maybe she plans. Well, she's going back there because of the fellowship she's got.
Good.
But she was teaching at Shaw, unless that was online. I guess she must have been around here. Yeah. Yeah, it's been kind of different because of the online stuff. We had one student, I don't know if you had her, Trebecca Hughes, I think, who was in Charlotte, didn't want to come here at all. And I said, you got to, we're here, we had it online for COVID, but in the fall and she apparently has just dropped out.
Yeah, evidently she dropped out because I talked to her one time and she didn't show up anymore.
Even after I gave her the opportunity one semester I said, I'll give you this work and you turn it in regularly, she didn't turn in anything.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't think she was that serious about it.
I think she's in Winston-Salem.
But so I think we're all set. I think this is my last one of the semester.
I gotta have one more. Ariel Moore. Does anybody know anything about that situation?
That's Lydia's student. Is she finishing?
They tell me May 2nd. I just received the thesis last night. And I told her last week if she wants me to be on it, you got to get it to me. And finally, I got 2 chapters last night. So I don't know what the plan is. I haven't talked to Dr. Lindsay about it. So I don't know.
Because the deadline is Wednesday, I think. I mean, Charles got an extension, but she could finish in the first summer session if he signs up for a thesis.
Yeah. Well, when she said May 2nd, I thought that was actually beyond the
deadline. The deadline, Prof, was Friday. So this past Friday. So we just got an extension to do this, and our deadline is Wednesday at 5. Those need to be done. And so you all will know I'm still going through Dana's. I didn't say anything that day, but I think I had indicated, man, that was a heavy lift. You know, just trying to get her to even use spell check. I mean, you can look and see the little squiggly lines yourself.
Right,
You
exactly.
know, that kind of thing. It's just very, very, very challenging getting through
Of
that.
course, like Ori does have to put in those footnotes. I hope she hasn't, maybe she's done them already, but
I didn't. I checked, and she's still working on. She's corrected a lot, but she still has some of that to get through. And I'll make sure that she does that. I'm not as she's followed through. I'm not as worried about her not following.
Can she see my comments, or should I just send her the paper?
You can.
I have a lot of yellow marks through the paper. Can she
You
see
might.
that?
Did you put that in the Google document, Doc? Is that
No,
did
no,
you used a Word? She sent you a Word document?
Word doc, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and just send that to her.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I'm going to send her mine too.
Okay. 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 All right. Well, I'm not gonna. I'll go ahead and see if we can start let people back in. I think. Well, let me see. I don't see her. Ori, are you there?
Yeah.
There she is. Okay, Ori, we just wanted to say congratulations to you. You know, obviously, I mean, this is an open secret. I mean, everyone was just extremely impressed with your work, and very, very, as your advisor, just very proud of you. You're a very easy student to work with. Your accomplishments go so far beyond just this thesis. I mean, you know, as I recall, we actually got off to a bit of a slow start because I think you were finishing something, if you recall. Yeah. But you poured it on, and man, you've been exceptional. My colleagues that you've worked with on other campuses still talk about you and ask about you and rave about you. And you know, again, just you've really embodied what it is to be an Eagle and to be in this program. You've represented us so well.
Congratulations, Ori.
Thank you all.
Oh,
Support during this time. I appreciate y'all, and to all of the narrators that I worked with who are on the call, like, thank y'all, because I really could not have done this without y'all. Like, so yeah, thank you to everybody who listened to me bitch and moan and cry about this for the past 2 years. I really appreciate it.
Tell us about your plans for the next 2 years.
So I will be doing the Smith Applied Public History Fellowship at the National African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C. So I'll be doing a little bit of curation work, working on turning this into an article. And then after that fellowship ends, or rather the portion at the museum ends, I'll be working at an organization in DC that works on public history. So just, yeah, trying to continue in this vein of being a public historian.
Great. Terrific.
good.
And thank you all. Yeah, just thank you all so much for supporting me through this really wild time to go get a degree. It's been really wonderful to work with you all and to see myself grow as a writer under your tutelage. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Or are there any other comments? Would anyone? I see the chat is kind of blowing up here, but if you'd like to comment, you're welcome to unmute and comment.
Ori, thank you. We're so proud of you. We see you. We love you. We appreciate you for bringing us into the space, into the writing, into the histories. Thank you. Thank you to the committee for seeing what we already knew, what we already see. Thank you.
Thank you, Ash. I love you.
Hey, Nisha, this is Mr. Liagi. I just want to say congratulations. I'm so proud of you. That's it. I'll see you in a few weeks.
Congratulations, friend. I'm so proud. I knew it.
Friend. Oh my God,
I'm
friend.
so proud of you. Oh my God.
Friend.
Congrats.
Jacoby, you up next?
Oh, mute.
No, he is. He is. Because he's going to get the PhD for both of us.
Okay.
We
That's
talked
okay,
about
because
that.
you're gonna write this book, and I want to say that I'm so happy for you, and I hope that this moment is so affirming to you, because I know that you have had your own personal doubts in this process, but I hope that this moment just affirmed you and your writing and your work, and I look forward to you doing more magical things, and I hope that you do decide to write the book.
Sis, I love you.
Congratulations on shutting all of this down. It was incredible. It was wonderful seeing you in your element. I am so honored to be talking to a future New York Times bestselling author and public historian. You can do no wrong, and I am so, so proud of you.
Thank you, Tuere. I love you so much.
Hey.
Thank y'all. I'm going to burst.
Got a lot of support, a lot of great support.
Yeah.
Sounds like your other committee approved you earlier than we did.
I was gonna say.
There's been many readers, many of whom are in this room right now.
Great.
That's wonderful. Okay, well, Ori, thank you again. This has been awesome. Dr. Gershenhorn and Dr. Parker, thank you for all that you have done, all your comments and revisions. I know that we'll be expecting to receive those so that Ori can go ahead and make those. And once we have those completed, I will get the signature form together and get that to you. But we will get those revisions completed first. And
Tomorrow.
oh yeah, so you've got to kind of hit the ground, take just a little bit of a respite, and then get right back into it so you can get that done. Dr. Gershenhorn?
Yeah, okay, so I'll send you my my version of your thesis with my comments and edits, and you can take a look at that. I'm sure Dr. Parker. Once again,
Same thing.
congratulations. Best of luck in DC. When are you moving? Are you moving back to DC, I guess, in the fall, or are you already in DC?
I'm not in DC right now. I'll be moving back in October because that's when my in-person start date begins. But the work itself starts in August, and I'll be going to the Association of African American Museums conference in Miami to start the process.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So do we get personal tours of the museum if we come to DC?
You know, I'm gonna try and pull all the strings I can for my people.
Thank you. All right.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay, all right. So we're going to go ahead and conclude today's defense, and thanks again to everyone for being here, and congratulations again.
Stay in touch with us now, Ori.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.